So we're beginning this second part of the chapter and the discussion with the extent of contemporary environmental concern. So the perceived and fact, there's both the perception and the fact of environmental problems and crises, and that's a very important factor. Okay? For Thoreau, the natural conscience reflected his concern about the increasing industrialization and new technologies that he saw that resulting from the Industrial Revolution. Uh, and certainly urbanization and industrialization have increased dramatically since then. And then, with their incredible environmental impacts that we are experiencing and witnessing today. And at the same time, the social class divisions and urban and rural inequalities have widened as well in our modern time period. So some environmental scholars and critics of environmentalism raise some counter arguments to that. And the first, they say that environmentalism is just a passing, as they refer to it, flavor of the month concern. And it's the kind of issue that people will quickly lose interest in. And then the second criticism is that environmentalism is mainly an elite concern. So we're going to address both of those criticisms and see if they're true or not, if they're accurate or not. And everything's got a little bit of truth to it, it seems like, but in general, I'll tell you right now, those criticisms are not particularly accurate, especially the first one. So in support of the flavor of the month argument, in support of it, it's important to acknowledge that the intensity of environmental concern varies widely from person to person. It varies widely from country to country, and it varies widely from time period to time period within the same country, as you'll see as we go through some of the research. So public concern for most issues follows a pattern of what's called the issue attention cycle, also known as compassion fatigue. I'm sure you've heard that a lot lately. You can get it in ads by organizations, trying to save endangered species or starving children around the world. You see those enough times, or you hear it enough times, and what is called compassion fatigue can set in. However, according to research, and it doesn't set in for everybody, by the way, but according to research, concern has grown, especially around environmental issues, especially in regard to climate change. Okay. I wonder why that might be. So concern has changed over time, of course, and especially as countries experience changes in leadership and the effects firsthand. Well, no, that makes perfect sense. You may not be concerned at all. You may think it's a bunch of hogwash until it happens to you, or your community, or your state, or whatever. Wildfires, hurricanes. Right now, people in India are dropping like flies because it's over 120 degrees every day, starting at the crack of dawn. Doesn't cool off much overnight anyway. Nobody, most people don't have air conditioning. It's just awful. Then you begin to get concerned. Okay. So as for environmentalism as a whole, because it's not just about climate change, there are both ups and downs in concerns. In the United States, for example, after a dramatic upswing in concern in the late 1960s, we talked about that after the publication of Silent Spring, and people kind of got up to speed with that and what was going on. It declined then, the concern, environmental concerns, through the 1970s. And for about a decade, it stayed down. But in the 1980s, there was a resurgence of concern. And by the 1990s, 75% of the country said that we weren't doing enough to improve and protect the environment. And concern continued to grow from there in small degrees between 2002 until the Great Recession in 2008. Now, what happened with the Great Recession, which was really a depression, but they were afraid, the economists and others, to say that in public because of the intense fear it would bring up, but it was pretty darn bad, the 2008 recession. Then people said to hell with the environment, basically, and prioritized economic growth, even if that meant the environment suffered. Okay. I hope that you can see how counterproductive that attitude and behavior is. And it's very common, and we see it today. Every time there's a downturn in the economy or something goes wrong, we see this happen. But eventually you have to deal with it. Eventually you have to face it. And the longer you put it off and prioritize other things other than changing habits about waste and consumption and miles one drives and a variety of other things. Now, I understand completely that there are many people who have very limited choices and options, but many of us do have choices and options. And to just throw out the idea of environmental concern because the economy's wobbly only makes things worse and puts off the inevitable. It's kind of like smoking when you know you shouldn't, right? Okay, so by 2011, environmental protection had fallen even more than it had. Now, there's still a majority of people who say they're interested. It's just, statistically watching the numbers and the percentages rise and fall. So, although public opinion fluctuates, it still has remained strong. It was at its lowest concern for the environment was at 54% in 2008. And there's been marked concern for about 75 years since people have been paying attention and keeping track. So how does social status affect environmental concern? Is environmentalism primarily an elite issue? Well, there has been research done about this too, as you might imagine. Sociologists love statistics and to do research. So research between 1973 and 1992 showed that income only had a minor effect on environmental concern, even during recessions. However, this is really interesting. People who were younger, members of the Democratic Party, well-educated and urban, and who did not work in primary industries like farming and forestry, they did tend to be more supportive of the environment. But the differences were only slight, the percentages. Okay. There were and are plenty of Republicans, less educated, rural, and primary industry employed people who profess environmental support in surveys. But since 2006, concern in the U.S. has deviated from international trends in an important way. This is all going to sound very, very familiar to you because we live it every day now in the United States. The way it has deviated from other countries' environmental concern, other industrialized nations, and the important way that it deviates is party affiliation is now the dominant predictor of environmental concern. Okay? So between 1974, this is amazing when you hear this. This is truly incredible. Between 1974 and 1991, Democrats and Republicans showed little difference in ideological support for environmental spending, a trend that is called convergence. They were together, they converged, right? But since then, the gap between Republican and Democratic support of increased spending on environmental protection grew from 2 percentage points in 1990 to, this is the difference, okay, the gap between them. Started out at 2%, a very small gap in 1990, right, to 39 points in 2012. That is a trend called divergence. They're moving away from each other. Okay? So the issue of climate change is a very important example of divergence. In 1998, 47% of Republicans said the effects of climate change had already begun, compared to 46% of Democrats. Slightly, 1 percentage point more of Republicans said climate change had already begun than Democrats did in 1998. That's a statistical tie, obviously. But by 2008, okay, it's so amazing. Only 41% of Republicans agreed, compared to 76% of Democrats. That's a 35-point gap, from a statistical tie to a 35-point gap, okay, in 10 years, okay? Now, as of 2019, this survey is registered voters, okay? Only this is just registered voters. So as of 2019, 73% of the registered voters that they surveyed agreed that climate change is happening. Okay, that's 73% of them. And here's how this breaks down. 49% of Republicans, but 92% of Democrats in 2019. So the Pew Research results show that partisanship outweighs even scientific knowledge. It is so disturbing to me in predicting attitudes about climate change. So let me say that again. Partisanship outweighs scientific knowledge in predicting attitudes about climate change. 93% of Democrats with a high level of knowledge about science said climate change is caused by humans, compared to only 23% of Republicans with a high scientific knowledge. That's a 70-point gap. Okay. Within both parties, though, younger people have a much higher level of concern. And I wrote a note to myself that I'm going to share with you. I wonder why. Because we're going to be gone when it gets really, really bad if we don't do something, right? It's the younger people. That's why Greta Thunberg is going, crazy about this. Is there no concern for the people that we leave behind? Apparently not much by some people. So it's very heartening to me that with a 70-point gap between Democrats and Republicans, both who have the survey they did, people with a high scientific knowledge, that doesn't apply to the young people, okay? That when you look at both parties, younger people have a much higher level of concern. Okay? So for example, 59% of Republican millennials accept that climate change is affecting the environment, and 46% agree that it is human caused, so that's good. When you start addressing specifics rather than climate change in general, then the agreement increases. Okay, so regardless of party affiliation, the majority of registered voters support pro-environmental policies like renewable energy investment, tax rebates for solar panels, the Paris Climate Agreement, that type of thing. So how do you explain these trends? Well, I tried to explain one about the younger people. So researchers term it this is going to offend some of you, but let's just get through it because you'll see what the specifics are here. Okay, it sounds very generalized in terminology. So researchers term it how do you explain the trends as the white male effect? Okay, and here's the important point, the conservative white male effect, which is what the accurate terminology should be. We're going to peel the onion here and you're going to see what we're talking about. So first of all, conservative white men report much less concern with health risks, technological hazards, and environmental protection than other groups do. In 2004 research, it was found that decreasing environmental concern can be ranked by 4 groups: women of color, men of color, white women, and white men. More recent research indicates women and people of color are still today more likely to accept that climate change is a real threat. Conservative white men still show the lowest levels of concern, and most of the white male effect can be attributed to those conservative white males. I would say highly conservative white males. Research from 2008 through 2017 of 20,024 US adults shows that increasing social status is associated with even more polarization about the environment. So maybe I want you to see the connection here. The more money you have and the more social status you have, it's associated even more with this polarization about the environment. As income and education levels go up, only in this group, conservative white males show even less concern. Why? Because, as we learned in the previous chapter on environmental domination, there's evidence that at a minimum, okay, income is coincidental with the connection between social domination and environmental domination. Okay. Now, you can be wealthy and of course not and of course be concerned about the environment, but it has to do with philosophy and values. Take 2 wealthy people, 2 different value systems, and what this shows is that the more conservative you are, the less likely you are, and wealth contributes to that even more, the less likely you are to be concerned about the environment. Okay. Remember that those with greater social power are less likely to suffer the consequences of environmental problems. Okay, we learned that too. You can protect yourself to a certain extent. To the point that people are thinking about going off planet, you know, a variety of things. And when I added there, you can do it for a time. You can protect yourself from the consequences for a time. Ultimately, it will affect everyone, rich or poor alike. You know, they may be the last ones standing, but it, you know, not addressed, it will affect everyone. And so I would call that false consciousness, not that they can't get that, you know, that it will affect that. Your money can only protect you for so long and from so many things. Okay. So research shows that the risk that people perceive is not just a material threat, but a cultural threat as well. So the more conservative, the more white male, the wealthier, the more you see yourself a certain way, the more power you actually have in many situations in society, the more you do actually have more power. And that's cultural stuff, right? And nobody likes their cultural stuff being threatened. It's a very provoking knee-jerk reaction anybody has to their cultural norms and values being attacked in any way or threatened in any way. That's the beauty of cultural anthropology. You kind of hopefully learn to lessen those reactions a bit by you know, learning about other people and other ideas. So cultural values in this in our country in particular, and in context with this discussion in particular, run along 2 broad axes. And one is now think about this, individualist to communitarian. So people who are very individualistic to people who are very into community. That's one axis. The second one is egalitarian to hierarchical. People who are very much into equality, egalitarian, to people who are not, who are very much into a hierarchy where some people have more power than others, okay? So what happened when they looked at the research of these personality types and things is that, and belief systems, is that environmental concern rose. So concern for the environment increased as a person moved from a hierarchical individualism to hierarchical communitarian to egalitarian individualists, and finally the people who are most concerned are egalitarian communitarians. In other words, people who believe in equality and community are the most worried about the environment. There's a table in your book that follows that. So white men, conservative white men, we always have to have that in there, not just white men in general. Conservative. I would say, as I said before, highly conservative white men were considerably more likely to be hierarchical individualists. And these men that are driving that overall, what's termed the white male effect inaccurately, because it's only this group, this smaller group of white males that are driving. But when you do a statistical analysis of white males, and then you say they're less worried about the environment, that effect of that percentage is coming from the conservative white males in the group. And they've broken it up and done research in both. And so we know that that's where that effect is coming from. Because white men with egalitarian and communitarian values viewed environmental risks the same way as any other groupings that believe in equality and community. And that goes across gender and racial and class lines. So white men are no different if they believe in equality and community. Okay. Hierarchical individualists often find environmental problems challenge their cultural identity. Okay. You can think about this. If your cultural identity, I don't know, I guess I have to think carefully here about what I'm going to say. But if your cultural identity involves vehicles that are huge gas hogs and, I'm trying to think, let's just stick with that one, okay? Then for you to have to decide to buy, now they're making hybrid trucks and electric trucks, which is wonderful. But you've got to go through a whole cultural adjustment before you would even consider that, right? And what that does to your image and the people you know and how they think about you, et cetera. So that's what they're talking here about, how these, if you're a hierarchical individualist, then these environmental problems challenge your cultural identity. And so to protect your identity, people often unconsciously, people who are that way often unconsciously downplay the significance of environmental concerns. However, a word of caution about how to interpret the roles of race and gender in such findings. It's really important to understand that all of this that we just talked about, right, is a matter of social context, not biology. Okay. Because remember, if you're going to think about race, right, and you have that white male effect, that's why I say it should never be used. It should be the conservative white male effect, because it has nothing to do with being a white male. It has everything to do with being conservative, because white males who aren't conservative are concerned about the environment, many of them. Okay, so here's the deal, the social context, i.e., white men are more likely to be socialized into being hierarchical individualists. Those values are inculcated into little boys, often winning, being a star athlete, being strong and being able to, maintain control over things. All of those things socialize one into hierarchical individualism. So, although there's no biological connection between white men and anti-environmentalist attitudes, the social construction of race and gender can make it more likely for people from different social groups to hold worldviews, right, that are harmful to the environment. And that's cultural, those worldviews. It's also important to note and to remember that we're talking about tendencies here, right? It's not all hierarchical, conservative white males by any means. So they're tendencies. The environmentalism of the poor. Let's look at that, because this has been something that's been very controversial as well. Well, the poor, remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Well, they could never be concerned about the environment because they're concerned about survival. And we kind of pick that argument apart, and we're going to look at it more deeply now. So there is lots of evidence of of a lot of environmental concern among the poor, both in wealthy countries and elsewhere. The Indian sociologist Ramakrishna Guha says the environmental of the poor often differs, however, from the environmentalism of the rich. Well, for one thing, remember, they're not protected from it the way the rich can protect themselves often. No, I just said, most people in India don't have air conditioning, right? Okay, and it's over 120 degrees there every day now. The rich in India can protect themselves, but they're a very small percentage of the giant population there. So first and foremost, the environmentalism of the poor combines a concern with the environment with a visible concern for environmental justice. But an emphasis on justice has also been part of the environmentalism of the poor in rich countries, as in the US, because there are thousands of community level groups that address injustice in the United States, including environmental injustice. So there used to be this idea that poor countries and poor people weren't interested in environmentalism, as I said about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And there may have once been a grain of truth to that assumption, but no longer. Research shows that's just not true any longer, if it ever was. Concern has certainly spread of environmental problems beyond the academy, beyond universities and research institutes and scientists. It's no longer, therefore, an elite concern. It's everyone's concern. So there's two theories of contemporary environmental concern, and we're going to go through those. So several theories find that the origin of concern lies originally in the changes of material conditions in society. This is a theme, right? Through this whole course, through this chapter in particular, that material conditions change the way we think about things. And in this case, we're talking about environmental concern. So, environmental concern begins as a material moment. Isn't that a great terminology? A material moment in the dialogue. And then it moves to an ideal moment as understanding the changes. So there's a material moment when the change occurs. There's an ideal moment. Remember, that's ideology, thinking about understanding the changes, and then in turn that leads to attempts to change the negative material conditions. Okay, so this leads to basically two theories: the paradigm shift theory and the ecological modernization theory. So first, the paradigm shift theory is the rise of broad concern that relates to the concrete evidence of environmental decline that may lead to a fundamental shift in our ideologies. The wildfires in the West, and they're happening right now in New Mexico, right? Again, has led to a fundamental shift. It's just too big, too much of a change in the material world to deny what's going on, okay? That's the paradigm shift theory. There was a paradigm shift about what was going on with the wildfires, okay? There was a paradigm shift about pesticides with Silent Spring, as an example. Okay, the second theory is the ecological modernization theory, which says we've recently It's kind of the don't worry, be happy theory. We've recently begun to overcome the opposition of the economy, because the economy is always opposing environmental changes that would help the environment, that would address the problems. Okay. So this opposition of the economy and ecology, which in the past has prevented us from adopting environmental concern. Now, as you can see, material changes play a huge role in both of those theories. First, we're going to look at the paradigm shift theses. So people are becoming more aware of the real material effects that industrialism has on the environment. Therefore, they are steadily adopting a more environmentally aware view of the world. And slowly, ideologies are beginning to change to match the new understanding of the observed material changes. So the central feature in a paradigm shift is acknowledging and understanding that human beings are no longer exempt from environmental implications. And the final piece of that paradigm shift in this subject is that we're seeing ourselves as connected to the environment and not separate from it. I've been teaching this stuff for years because it's all, there's a chapter on the environment in every social problems book, in every cultural anthropology textbook. And years ago, probably 10 years ago now, I realized I had a paradigm shift. I realized I couldn't keep my old car that I adored. I had a wonderful old, God, I don't know what year it was, 80s, I think, 90s maybe, probably 90s, yeah, red Volvo station wagon. And it was in perfect condition. I just loved it. It had a million miles on it. But I realized, it was like getting like 20 miles to the gallon or less. And I just couldn't do it anymore. I just couldn't do it anymore. So it still was on the road. I gave it to my daughter, but she didn't have to commute the distance I did every day when I was going to SWAC every day, going to school every day, and commuting, an hour round trip. And I bought a hybrid Prius, and I've had one ever since. And I'd love to get an all-electric one, but it was a total paradigm shift for me that, wait a minute, I'm standing up here talking about this stuff and teaching it to people, and I'm not walking my talk. That is a paradigm shift. Okay. So in this new paradigm, humans are part of nature and need to maintain a sense of balance and live within the limits of an interconnected world. And researchers have termed this the new ecological paradigm, among other terminologies. There's a bunch of them in your book. But why might people's ideas change dramatically? So dramatically that it is indeed a paradigm shift. Oh, the world isn't flat. Oh, the sun doesn't revolve around the earth. Oh my goodness, that's huge, right? So the University of Washington University of Washington Research investigated this paradigm shift by distinguishing between environmental beliefs and environmental values. And this is exactly what happened with my Volvo Prius story, okay? The difference between environmental beliefs and environmental values. The beliefs are what people think environmental conditions and relations are. The values are what we think they should be, okay? So one would think that they correlate very closely, but no, they don't, not so. The study found much stronger support for environmental beliefs than environmental values. 57% stronger beliefs. Only 25 were strong believers, but only 25% were strong valuers. Okay. It's easy to have a belief. It's harder to have values. Because when you have values, you have to walk your talk, right? You have to do the work. You have to make the sacrifices. A belief, you can believe in anything you want, right? But you don't necessarily have to enact it. Okay, so that's it. It's more than half were believers, but not strong valuers. So the conclusion of the researchers was that the anomaly represents the slow process of people's values catching up with their beliefs. And you need this strong foundation of understanding and commitment to actually enact what ought to be, which is to act on your values. Because it often involves some sort of sacrifice or compromise to act on your values from what you've been doing and saying you believe. So let's look at the ecological modernization theory. I like what the text says here. If you keep stubbing your toe when you kick the environment, chances are you will, hopefully, reconsider what you're doing in the first place that makes you stub your toe. There's an AA saying, an Alcoholics Anonymous saying, doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. Okay? You can't do the same thing over and over and expecting different results. It doesn't work. If you do the same thing, you're going to get the same results. Okay? So ecological modernization contends that the recognition of environmental problems is starting to reshape the institutions of social politics and modernity in fundamental ways. Well, see, it's the don't worry, be happy one. Is that true? That it's shaping institutions and social politics to relate to the reality of environmental crises? In the Nordic countries, it is, and in Germany, apparently. I put up 2 videos for you about what's called the Nordic model, and I think you'll see how amazingly different that is. This ecological modernization has worked there. It has not worked here much at all. So material conditions, which are the environmental problems, shape the ideals, which in turn reshape the social conditions. Well, that's true. It is true here. I need to back up a little bit. It's just the extent to how true it is here is so minimal compared to, once again, the policies that exist in the Nordic model. What individuals do is crucially important, but where the huge change comes is on policy levels, that type of thing. So the central process of ecological modernization is that we increasingly consider more than just the economic, technological, political, and social reasons for making decisions about how to organize our lives. The problem was never modernization itself, but rather simple modernization, as the text puts it. So it's very well stated. Simple modernization is driven almost exclusively by the economy and technology and politics and society. And it doesn't take into account ecological rationality. Ecological rationality is my favorite question. Well, what did you think would happen if you polluted all the rivers and, cut all the forests? What did you think would happen? That's not ecological rationality, is it? So if you put in ecology to those other things, the economy, technology, politics, and society, then you repair the, quote, design fault of an economic and technological order that has been based on the presumption that the ecology is just this free service that we don't need to pay much attention to. That stuff's always just going to be there. And so there is some progress, even in America, To justify this idea of ecological modernization, hybrid cars and all electric cars, solar, wind, wave electricity, low flush toilets, the environmental laws and regulations that we have. What about energy saving appliances? You get tax rebates if you do that, or if you install solar panels, those types of things. But as I said, unfortunately, on the broad scale, ecological modernization only applies to a few countries in Europe, Germany, the Netherlands, and the Scandinavian countries. And look at those videos. They're short videos. So now let's look briefly, as we close this chapter, at the dialogue of environmental concern. So environmental concern is both old and new. We went to the very old, didn't we, with ancient Greece and China and India. The reason it's both old and new is because it's based on enduring moral issues stemming from the challenges of social inequality. Is the basis of all of this environmental concern and the dialogue of it. Okay. So it includes the desire to find that natural conscience that we talked about earlier, and the constancy of the environmental threats, and who gets the bads and who gets the goods of the environment. So a dialogue, or in a dialogue, in a conversation, the material is not only shaped through the moral, but it's also shaped through our ability to conceptualize environmental problems as problems, okay? Many people are very, very, very resistant to doing that. And I think fear is at the basis of a lot of that. Fear of very real, the potential of very real consequences, fear of having to give up something, right? Whether that's money or power or whatever. So those are some of the reasons. Until we can conceptualize the environmental problems as real, genuine problems, we don't have a complete dialogue in a sense. So there's a postscript here that I really like. It goes back to something that was earlier in the chapter, the connection between the material and the ideal. And that we have to retell and reimagine the story, and we have to change our priorities very, very much. So that story about one of the author's mothers and the property that they owned and that they would go to every year, the whole family, that had been there from the great-grandparents' day, if not earlier. And remember, when the mother was a little girl, what they did was they threw all the garbage into the river, roll out to the middle of the lake. And we're not necessarily talking about organic garbage here. We're talking about cans and bottles and, you know, a whole bunch of stuff like that. So what the native peoples called that area where that river was the Garden of the Great Spirit. And that was where the river was that people dumped garbage in it for generations. And in the author's mother's day, the approach was much more, as she said, environmentally casual. We talked about this. And so did his mother really believe that, as her mother told her, don't worry about it, you know, the river's bigger than all of us, i.e. the river will take care of it? And she said, yes, we all did back then. It was just part of the culture. We couldn't imagine that people could have such an effect on the environment, that things were so connected. And they are.